Good morning, everybody. I want to welcome you today. Waiting for our worship team to get up here. Slowly but surely making it up. You may not know, but I got a guitar a few weeks ago. It's for our anniversary and Father's Day present. So I've been practicing some. I'm almost ready to play a song, so we might get there soon. But until then, I'm going to keep doing the pre-recorded worship like we've had.
Are you hurting and broken within? Overwhelmed by the weight of your sin? Jesus is calling. Have you come to the end of yourself? Do you thirst for a drink from the well? Jesus is calling. To the altar, the Father's arms are open wide. Forgiveness was bought with the precious blood of Jesus Christ. Father's arms are open wide. Forgiveness was bought with the precious blood of Jesus Christ. Oh, come to the altar. The Father's arms are open wide. Forgiveness was bought with the precious blood of Jesus Christ. Bear your cross as you wait for the crown. Tell the world of the treasure you found.
Oh, Savior, isn't He wonderful? Christ is risen, Lord of lords, and King of kings. No matter what you're facing this morning, you can have the altar right where you're at and know there's power in the finished work of Calvary. Heavenly Father, we come to the name of Jesus, Lord God. Lord, what an awesome treasure, Lord God. You saw us to be, Lord God, saw us through the mess, Lord God, Father, that we are prone to be, and the glorious image of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ that we are to become, Lord. We thank you that you found us, Lord God, because not that we found you, Lord. Father, yes, we're singing, Lord God, about the treasure that was found, Lord God, Father, Lord. It's not so much hidden, Lord God, but open our eyes to see it, Lord. And we've come this morning to exalt, to lift up on high, to declare the power of the name of Jesus Christ. Lord, we welcome you. Have your way in every heart and mind this morning. Minister to whatever needs are here this morning, Father God. Minister to those, Lord God, who are listening online, lives and families, Lord God, Father. This word, Lord God, would come and find sore way to receive it, Lord God, Father. That we would go forth and be doers of the word that's going to challenge us, the very core of our being this morning, Father God. Again, touch each and every need, Father God, physically, and whatever it is, Lord, you are the answer, Lord God, Father, the great and awesome King of kings and Lord of lords. Oh, what a Savior that we have, Lord. We give you the glory, we give you honor, we give you praise. We give you abundant over each one as we went to the floor. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Amen.
Let the King of my heart be the mountain where I run, the fountain I drink from.
When darkness tries to roll over my bones, when sorrow tries to steal the joy I own, when brokenness and pain is all I know, oh, I won't be shaken, I won't be shaken, 'cause my fear doesn't stand a chance when I stand in your love. My fear doesn't stand a chance when I stand in your love. My fear doesn't stand a chance when I stand in your love. She no longer has a place to hide. Come on, let's declare this. Let's declare this over our lives. Oh, I am standing on the rock. Yeah, I am standing in your love. Yeah, I am standing on the rock. My firm foundation, my firm foundation. We sing it. Oh, I am standing on the rock. Yeah, I am standing in your love. Oh, I am standing on the rock, my firm foundation. My firm foundation. Oh, yeah. I am standing on the rock. Yeah, I am standing in your love. Yeah, I am standing on the rock, my firm foundation, my firm foundation. 'Cause my fear doesn't stand a chance when I'm standing in your love. My fear doesn't stand a chance when I'm standing in your love. My fear doesn't stand a chance when I'm standing in your love. I'm standing in your love. Oh, I stand in your love. Yeah.
Just want to thank the Lord for that love and that rock that we stand on. I'm really bad at this, so I tried to make a point in the song service to remind you guys about offering. You all, sorry, not all of you are guys. So I want to remind you, we have the buckets in the back and over here. If you're online, you can, let me see if I can get this up here for you. You can find us a bunch of places online. So Facebook, fb.firstag.co. YouTube is yt.firstag.co. You can get us on our live page at live.firstag.co. And then giving, that's the one that I want to remind you about, is giving, giving.firstag.co. And you can also mail in your donations and checks, please. Cash is dangerous to send through the mail. And so First Assembly of God, 1111 North Shenandoah Avenue, Front Row, Virginia 22630. All that said, I just really want to thank everybody, because people are really doing a great job to continue to support the church through all of this. We have been having people give online and hearing meetings and checks. Everything that's going on. I know that a lot of churches are really struggling trying to come up with unique ways and everything. But, you're providing, we know that God usually provide for us. And I just thank all of you, all of everybody online, everybody here. Thank you very much. We're going to sing a couple more songs, and then I'm going to preach. The last song we're going to sing before we get into the sermon was requested by Dancy. It's a little bit different than what was originally planned, but it's the same song, just with some extra parts, sort of like how we do It Is Well, and we've got a whole bunch of other stuff with that. So I think that will hopefully be very acceptable.
You were the Word at the beginning, one with God, the Lord Most High. You hidden glory in creation, now revealed. When peace like a rain.
The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters. He restores my soul. He guides me in the paths of righteousness, for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil. For you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You have anointed my head with oil. My cup overflows. Surely goodness and loving kindness will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever.
Again, I just want to thank everybody for joining us today. For the people who are able to join us here in person, also for everybody that's able to join us online. Today I'm going to be speaking about grief. I think grief is a very difficult subject to talk about, and so this is not necessarily a shouting sermon, if you catch my meaning on this. But I think there's a lot of shouting parts to this sermon. There's a lot of great things to understand and know whenever it comes to grief. Right now there's definitely a lot of cause for grief. Grief is really about loss. And I think that we understand that loss is such a painful thing to endure. With everything that's going on, I think people are experiencing loss in a lot of different ways today. We obviously have loss of things that seem a little more familiar. Family members who have passed on, and even though we know that they are with God, it's still a loss to us because we're not with them. But with everything going on with the virus, with rioting, with everything else, there's other losses. We think about the class of 2020. They lost so much. Those final months together in high school and college, they lost the kind of graduation that they always envisioned themselves having. They lost the prom that they always thought that they would have. The class of 2021 may lose a lot of the same things. I know my daughter, she was in color guard, and last year was color guard captain, was really looking forward to doing band camp this year. Megan is going into high school, and this would have been their 1 year at band camp together. What a thing for them to lose as sisters is a moment where they could have come together, but now they're not going to have this. Courtney was talking the other day about looking forward to senior night, and it's a special night they do during the last football game of the year, the last home game of the year. And it's to honor the seniors in the football team, the cheer, and in band. And she doesn't get that now. She doesn't get to be a part of that, and it feels like such a big loss. And so there's grief with all of these things. We just celebrated Father's Day last week. About a month ago, we celebrated Mother's Day. And a lot of you know, for Susan and I, years ago, before Courtney was born, Father's and Mother's Day became a time of grief. She had had 2 miscarriages and then a tubal pregnancy, and the thought of going to church and celebrating motherhood or fatherhood was too painful to bear. We celebrate these holidays, and it's a great time. I love it because I get to celebrate my dad. I get to celebrate being a father. But for many, they're suffering in grief. We think about these things, and we realize that for some, Father's Day comes around, Mother's Day comes around, and they're celebrating the loss of a child. What a painful thing to think about. They're enduring, rather, the desire to be a parent, but the inability. They're suffering through the loss of their own parent. What a difficult time. And so today we're going to talk about grief and what that means to us. But in the middle of all of this, I want to keep an eye on what it means to God. Before we get there, I want to, I have lost a slide, and I apologize, but it's okay. I'll tell you what's on it. The world has a view of grief. You guys have probably heard of the stages of grief, specifically the 5 stages of grief. Has anybody heard of that? Can you raise your hand? 5 stages of grief? So for those of you who may not have heard about it, the basic idea is you start off, or the first stage of grief is denial. It's saying that, oh, this hasn't actually happened, it can't be real, I don't understand how this can be real, I won't believe that it's real. Then you have anger, and so you get very angry about what's going on. You're just unreasonably angry. Just anything can set you off, and you're frustrated and irritable, and just no matter what happens, you just And then there's the depression stage where you just are sobbing and weeping, and you feel like there's no hope for tomorrow. We just sang that, bright hope for tomorrow. And so grief is taking us through all of these experiences, and you get to bargaining, and the idea of bargaining is say, God, if you'll do anything, I'll do anything for you. I'll be good. I'll do all this if you just bring them back, whatever that loss is, restore that to me. And then finally, you get to acceptance. I accept that this is reality. I will make it through all of this. And the presentation, the idea that a lot of people come up to is you start off in the beginning with denial, and you work your way through each stage, and you finally make it to acceptance. But the reality of it is you start somewhere in this process. It doesn't matter where. Some people, they start with anger. They hear something, they lose something, and they just... That's just their go-to move. Some people start with depression or bargaining. Like the first thing, the doctor comes and says it's cancer, and immediately they're bargaining. They believe it is, they know it is, and now they're bargaining. You move around through this. So maybe you started with denial and then moved on to depression, then backwards to anger, and then back into depression, and then over into denial, and you're back and forth through all of these things. And then you get to acceptance. You're like, fine, I accept that this is reality. And then 2 days later, you wake up just sobbing in tears again, even though you've accepted it. And so the stages of grief aren't really an outline to say you move from one to the next to the next to the next, but rather this idea of a cycle that you're going through and different experiences that you have. But the whole goal of everything, the world's goal of everything, is to come to acceptance. And I think great idea to accept the thing that you have lost. But God has better ideas in mind for you. But before we get into that, I want to talk about the absolute shortest scripture. It's my favorite scripture when I was growing up because it was so short, I memorized it in one sitting. Does anybody know what that scripture is? Jesus wept. John 11:35. It is the shortest scripture in the Bible. It's 2 simple words, and it's possibly one of the most powerful scriptures that we have. Most of you know the background of this already. Lazarus is very sick. And so Mary and Martha sin for Jesus, but Jesus delays. He hears the word of this, and he tells the disciples, this isn't a sickness leading to death. Which is interesting because Lazarus dies. Jesus hangs out for 2 days, and he says, I am not going to go just yet. We've got things to do. And he talks to them about the resurrection. He talks to them about power and all of these different things. But the disciples don't really get it. So finally he gets ready to go, and he tells the disciples, Lazarus has gone to sleep. And the disciples go, oh, that's good. He really needs his rest. If he's going to recover, he's got to sleep. And Jesus is like, oh, children, I love you. Bless your hearts. Whatever the Jewish equivalent of that was of the day. And he says, all right, guys, I'm going to be very clear. Lazarus is dead, and they've put him in a hole in the ground. Do you understand me now? And the disciples are like, oh, I'm so sorry for your loss. Just like, it's okay. It's okay. It'll be fine. This was for God's glory. That's literally Jesus' words. He said this happened so that God would receive glory. And obviously everybody's like, I don't get it. How does God receive glory in the death of your friend? And so Jesus shows up. And he gets there, and Martha hears that he's coming and runs out to him. And Martha is angry. She's hot. That's her personality. We know Martha from another experience with Jesus, right? Mary and Martha are there, and Jesus is teaching, and Martha's running around doing all the cleaning, all the cooking, all the other stuff that needs to be done, and Mary is sitting at Jesus' feet just taking in what Jesus has to say. And so Martha gets angry, and she yells at Jesus. She's like, Jesus, do something about my sister. She won't listen. She won't help. She's being lazy. Right? That's Martha's personality. That's who she is. So she goes into the cycle of grief, and she's just straight into anger. And then Mary hears, and so she goes out, and she says the same thing that Martha said. They both said this. They said, if only you had been here. But Martha's like, if only you had been here. Why weren't you here? Why did you let this happen? Mary does something different. She's weeping. She's crying, if only you had been here, Jesus. I know you could have saved my brother. She's crying. And so Jesus says, take me to him. And in this moment, he sees Mary suffering. And he weeps. Such a powerful moment. Because he knows what's going to happen. He has no doubt that when he stands there, he's going to say, open up the grave. And he's going to say, Lazarus, come forth. And everybody's going to argue with him. He knows about all that. I probably just walked away out of frame. Nope, I'm good. Everybody knows what's going to happen. Jesus knows what's going to happen. Everybody's going to argue with him, but he knows that Lazarus is going to come forth, and so he's not separated. He's not experiencing the loss because he knows these things, and yet he sees Martha and Mary suffering in grief, and he's moved to weep. Let's talk about Job. Have you considered Job? Isn't that a loaded phrase, right? That's how it all starts for poor Job. You know the story. God is in heaven and the enemy comes by. And he's trying to make a case against everybody else. And so God says, have you considered my servant Job? What a setup. Have you considered my servant Job? There's a phrase that people say, and it's a bit of a curse. It's one of those things that sounds kind of like, oh, that's nice, but it's really kind of a curse. The phrase is, may you live in interesting times. Have you guys ever heard that phrase? May you live in interesting times. And the idea behind it is, interesting times are not always good times. There's a very big difference. In fact, wouldn't you agree that right now, today, we are living in interesting times? Anybody agree with that? Yes. All right, good. You guys are awake. So we are living in interesting times. Job got to experience interesting times. In fact, in one day, Job's oxen and donkeys are stolen, all but one of the servants are killed. The sheep and servants are killed from fire from the heavens, and only one servant survives. The camels are stolen, and all the servants are killed, and only one survives. And then finally, his children are having a big party, and there's a windstorm that comes up and drops the entire house on them, and all of them die, all the servants die, except for one who makes it away. And when you read this in the book of Job, it says that while the first servant is talking, the second servant comes up. So Job is hit by this. It's painful. It's overwhelming. And he sees another servant coming up, and he sees the look on that guy's face, and he's like, the good news is not coming from him. And so that guy starts talking, and it's painful, and it's overwhelming. And then the next guy, the same thing happens. While the second guy is still talking, the third one comes up. He's got blood on him. His cloak and stuff are torn. Job knows this is not more good news. And then while the third guy is still talking, the fourth guy comes up. And again, Job is like, what more can happen? How much worse can this get? And he finds out all of his children have died. And then this is Job's response in verse 20, Job chapter 1, verse 20 and 21. Then Job arose and tore his robe and shaved his head and fell on the ground and worshipped. And he said, naked I came from my mother's womb, naked shall I return. The Lord gave and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord.
In the middle of all of this loss, Job's response is to worship God. I have to admit, I'm not sure that I'm ready to go there. In the middle of these things, my response is to be angry at God. God, why did you let this happen? Job gets there eventually. I get there a lot faster. Like immediate loss, like, driving down the road, I got a nail in my tire goes flat. God, why did you let this happen? Like, it doesn't take a lot for me. I get there fast. Anybody else get there fast? Am I alone? Okay, I'm glad I'm not alone. I'm a little bit like Martha. I get her. I understand her response to Jesus. She was angry, and I get it. Why? I go to get some milk in the morning to make my iced matcha, and it's like I don't have enough. Why did you let this happen? Because you didn't tell your wife to go get more milk soon enough. I try and let her know sooner, but it just happens. Sometimes it's my own clear fault, but I'm just immediately like, "Argh." But Job's response is to worship God. It's almost like he starts off at acceptance, doesn't he? He starts off by saying, this is life. I had nothing when I was born. I'll have nothing when I die. And in between, God gives and he takes away. And so he is righteous and he is holy and it doesn't matter. It's like, oh, Job, you're making all of us look bad. Anybody else feel that way? Like, I don't do this well. But Job is also going through extreme grief. I mean, he starts off by ripping his clothes, doesn't he? Tears his clothes. He shaves his head. He is saying, I am going into mourning. This is what they did. This was a sign of mourning. Sackcloth and ashes, shaving your head, doing all of these things is about mourning and saying to the world, I am grieving all of these things. We think about David, and David, he had his sin with Bathsheba, then Bathsheba got pregnant, and then the story, Nathan comes along, right? And Nathan tells him the story about a guy who had this one little pretty sheep, and he loved the sheep, and he took care of the sheep, all the things like that. And then there was another guy who had a whole herd of sheep, but he was jealous of the guy who had the one little sheep, so he steals the sheep and kills the guy, and all these things, and David's just like, that guy will be judged, I will destroy him. And then Nathan's like, that was you, that sheep was Bathsheba, and you had all of these other things, but you had to take Bathsheba, and you had to kill Uriah and all this. And then Nathan gives David the news that there's going to be a loss of life, that the baby's not going to survive. And so David goes into mourning. He takes off his fine robes, he can't be consoled, he's grieving, he's going through all of these things, right? That's what David does. And then the news comes that the baby is dead. And suddenly he just puts on his nice robes. He does all of the fineries. He goes back to it. And his servants are like, what's up with that? So David says, while he was alive, there was hope that he might be healed, that he might survive. But now that he's dead, it's time to move on. I can't do anything to change this. I accept what has happened, and it's my fault, and I get it. But I accept it. David moved on to acceptance. Job seems to reach acceptance early. But then later on, Job begins to lament his life. We begin to see that Job is struck with great boils. Again, that phrase, have you considered my servant Job? And so God says you're allowed to touch his health. You're allowed to make him sick. And so he has these boils, and we see Job with sores that he's scraping with pot shards, sitting in ashes. And I have to admit, I can understand that feeling a little bit. I don't have great big sores, but sometimes, every so often, I get a migraine that's just so bad. It's like, it feels like if I could reach behind my eye and just scratch back there, it would make it better. Like, I know it can't, but it just feels so bad that if I could just scratch behind my eye where it hurts, it would get better. In my head, that seems to make sense. So I understand being in the middle of this, and it's just so miserable that he's just like, if I could just gouge out this nasty sore with a pot shard, it'll feel better. He was really hurting. And so Job begins to lament his own life. He says at one point, I wish I had never been born, or it would be better if I had never even been born. Has anybody heard of the movie It's a Wonderful Life? A few of you all? Chances are some of you have not heard of it, maybe online. Hopefully everybody's heard of it. It's a classic. Jimmy Stewart plays George Bailey. George Bailey, this is back just after the World War II. And people are rebuilding and everything's going along. And so he ends up working at a bank and helping to run things. And you know, he doesn't have the best life, but it's a good life. He's making a house, he's getting married, he's having all these things that he's establishing, like he's kind of building towards the American dream, right? And then some bad stuff happens. There's another bank that's trying to take everything over, and through a very series of circumstances, there's a character named Billy who's supposed to deposit $8,000. And she's got like this envelope with a wad of cash in it, and you know, that sounds like a lot of money to us today, but back when this was done, the timing of it, that's the equivalent of over $100,000. It's a lot of money. I mean, does anybody feel like losing $100,000 is just pocket change? I don't think we have anyone in this church that could have $100,000 fall out of your pocket and you don't even notice it. I think everybody here is like, if I had $8,000 fall out of my pocket, it would be detrimental to everything in the world. But this is a lot of money. And so it gets misplaced, and then, you know, George finds out about it, and people are talking about it, and just, he's beginning to get overwhelmed with everything that's going on. And he realizes that not only are they going to lose the bank, the house, he's going to potentially get tried for this, because that's a breach of trust and everything. And this kind of money, they're going to think he stole the money. And so he's thinking about possible lawsuits, possibly going to jail. And somebody even makes a comment at one point, "You're worth more dead than alive," because he's got a life insurance policy, and he starts to really think about that. And so suddenly he's standing on a bridge, and he's thinking about jumping off this bridge because he's thinking, "I'm worth more dead than alive. It's better if I had never been born." And then somebody shows up, Clarence shows up, and we find out that Clarence is an angel, and he says, "Okay, well, let's find out what would happen if you had never been born." And so then there's a whole act where they show everything that would have happened and how bad things would have been and the people who would have died and all the problems that would have come up as a result of George never being there. And so at the end of it, he's like, "Okay, I get it. I'm going to go back and I'm going to make it through all this." And everything turns around in George's life. It ends up becoming really good, in fact. They're able to find the money. They're able to restore everything. There's this whole great scene where people are making a run on the bank to try and get their stuff, and they're trying to make a withdrawal, and they don't have the money to do it. And George is standing up, "This is everybody's bank, everybody's money. You need to share everything and take care of everyone." You guys remember that scene? That might have been a really bad impression of him, but I was trying my best. And everything ends up turning around. That's the world's view of how things work for grief, how things work. You have to realize that the world would be so much worse if you weren't here. But Job says this, and then later on, Job is really lamenting his lot in life, and so God finally shows up on the scene, and God's response to Job isn't, "Okay, Job, the world would have been so much worse if you weren't here." God's response to Job is, it's a wonderful life, he's a wonderful God. That's God's response to Job. So we're dealing with grief, and Job is suffering loss, suffering grief, and then God comes along and says, "Who do you think you are? Do you think that you're the hero of this story? I know that we're going to write a book about this, and it's going to be named after you, but you're still not the hero of the story, Job. You're the background actor. You're just walking through the scene while I'm doing everything, Job." In fact, God starts listing out some of the many wonderful attributes of God. Just a short list here. He laid the foundation of the earth. He set a limit on the sea, and this is all poetic and beautiful. It's much better than the way I'm listing it out. He makes the new dawn daily. He walks in the depth of the sea, and he keeps the storehouses of snow and the storehouses of hail and the rain and everything else. He's the one in control of all of it. He brings the rain. He guides the stars. He keeps and tends all the animals. Isn't that what Jesus says in the New Testament? He says, the sparrow of the field doesn't fall unless God knows about it. He's in charge of all of these things. The lily in the valley doesn't wilt unless God knows about it. He gilds that very lily and makes it beautiful. That's who he is. In fact, he guides the behemoth. A great and mighty beast that's so terrible. I don't know necessarily what it is. Maybe the behemoth is a giant elephant. Maybe the behemoth is they found dinosaur bones or something like that, and they're like, this is a huge beast, and I really would be terrified for this to show up. And I think about the movie Jurassic Park. Have anybody seen that movie? It's one of Tony's favorite movies. And there's a scene early in the movie where they get to the island and the brontosauruses or possibly apatosauruses, because of the whole thing with science and stuff. But anyways, they stand up and they're up on their back legs eating the tree and then drop down like everything shakes. And if you saw this movie in the theater, everything shook. It was like boom, and for the people on the like that. It was really bad. Stuff fall down. They were huge and they were terrifying, and there was no way to control them. But God guides the behemoth. Takes the Leviathan out for walks. Again, I don't know necessarily what the Leviathan is. Maybe it's a huge whale. It talks about pulling it up with a fish hook. It's clearly this great monster of the sea, and God goes fishing for it. It says God takes it and walks with it. The power of God, he sees nothing in the greatest creatures of the land to just take them and care for them and guide them and be in control of them. He's magnificent, he's mighty, he's wonderful. He doesn't need to do anything for anyone about anywhere, but he does. We realize that God is a wonderful God, and still Jesus wept. I want you to think about that just for a moment. Who am I that God is mindful of me? Who are we collectively as all of humanity that God even cares? Wouldn't it be easier for him just to wipe the earth clean and start over? Wouldn't it be easier for him to say, you guys are a hot mess and I have no need to be involved with any of this garbage anymore. You cause me nothing but grief. When we suffer, he is magnificent. He is mighty. No matter what our circumstances, God is always on the throne, still in control, and has everything that he ever needs. And yet, Jesus wept. God grieves with us. Let's say that again. God grieves with us. When we're suffering, he grieves with us. See, when Martha came out angry at Jesus, "Why weren't you here?" He didn't say, "Settle down, Martha. It's all good. I'm in control. Chill. You don't need to be angry. Get over yourself." He doesn't. He could, but he doesn't. When Mary comes out, "Jesus, why? Why weren't you here?" He doesn't say, "Suck it up, Buttercup. I got this." I mean, he could. But instead, he weeps. He grieves. The things that God says to Job to establish who he is, to make it so clear that he is the one who is in control of everything, also establish how amazing it is that God grieves with us. The same God who stores up the snow. The same God who says to the sea, "This far and no more." The same God who spoke, "Let there be light," and laid the foundations of the earth. That same God cries when you're crying. God is moved by our pain, but he doesn't leave it there. It's not enough for God to just grieve with us. In the world's view, the stages of grief are done when you've moved to acceptance and stay there. But God restores us. See, God grieves with us and then He restores us. Isn't that what He does with Lazarus? He weeps. And then He says, open up that tomb. Then He says, Lazarus, come forth. God gives Job more than he lost. At the end of the story, Job has everything restored to him, double. In my life, we lost 3 children. It was painful. It was difficult. We were told there would be no children. It was painful. It was difficult. And God gave us 4 children. Sometimes it's painful and sometimes it's difficult. But we have 4 children we love very much. However, restoration doesn't always look like that. For some, restoration is peace in the storm. For some, it's God bringing forgiveness to the person who wronged you. For others, maybe God's help is to help you let go of the thing that is destroying you. There's this image that I see online. It's this little girl, and she's got her teddy bear, and she's holding it so close. And then you have this Jesus that's leaning over, holding this big, huge teddy bear behind her. He says, "Give me your teddy bear." And the idea is God takes from us so that He can give us better and more. But I don't know if that's necessarily the right idea of what restoration is. Sometimes God takes things out of our life because they're destroying our life. Sometimes God takes things out of our life because we look to that over God. Sometimes God takes things out of our life because that's the nature of life. People live, people die, and that's the nature of life. Sometimes restoration isn't about God giving you more. Sometimes restoration is about God putting the pieces back together. There's a Japanese art form. It's called kintsugi. I don't know if I pronounced that right. We're going to assume that I did. This is the art of repairing broken pottery. They take precious metals and they melt it down and they pour it into the seams. I don't know if anybody's ever tried to fix a broken pot, anything like that, and tried to use like super glue to put it together. But there's something that happens whenever pottery breaks. You can have all the pieces and put it back together, but when you super glue it together, there's little chips and divots and things like that that'll never be there because these teeny tiny little fragments just explode and disappear. It'll leave a little chip that you'll never ever find, a tiny dust of a fragment, and so you'll always see these seams, and it will never be the same as it was. But in this idea of kintsugi, they take and they pour precious metals in, and then they polish it down and smooth it out, and they make this beautiful restoration. The idea of it is it's actually considered more beautiful and more valuable than it was before. All of those things are filled in better than glue ever could. Better than trying to fit all of those tiny little pieces back into the life ever could. God's restoration oftentimes is taking the brokenness and putting it back together with something more valuable. And those more valuable things aren't always the things that we want them to be, but the things that God desires them to be. So that in the end, we become His perfect creation. A few weeks ago, I talked about that idea that we're works in process, works in progress, and talked about the idea of a statue, remember, and carving that out of a piece of marble, and how we're at different points along this path. It's the same idea that God has a plan for our life, and He desires to put us together and to make us whole and make us complete, to make us worthy of Him, because we can't do it on our own. We are broken. But God's restoration is repairing the brokenness in our life. We may not choose to look like what God has planned for us, but we have to recognize that God desires to restore us in ways that we never would have expected. I want to close by going back to Psalm 23, and if you have your Bibles, this is a good time to get there. The Lord is my shepherd, and I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside the still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in paths of righteousness for His name's sake. And even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows. Surely, goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life. And I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever. When grief comes, we have to recognize that God grieves with us. This is so important for us to understand because He understands our loss. And He says it's okay to experience that loss. We don't have to shut it up inside of us and say, oh God, if I trusted in you, I wouldn't feel like this. Before Jesus brought Lazarus back from the grave, He talked to them about the resurrection. And Mary and Martha were like, yes, we understand. Why are you bringing this up? We know that eventually there's going to be a day when we've died and He's died and we're all going to be resurrected. You told us all about that. God lets us experience the loss. He understands the loss, and He's going to grieve with you. Despite that, when grief comes, God is still wonderful. He is magnificent. He is on the throne, and He is in control. Folks, I said there was a part of the sermon where we can shout. This is the part. It may not feel like it at times. It may feel like everything's out of control, but God is in control. And He will grieve with us, and He will be wonderful while He grieves with us. He will be magnificent while He grieves with us. He doesn't lose anything by suffering this with us. But we don't stop at just the grief. We don't just stop at acceptance. When grief comes, restoration follows. It may not look like what we expect. Wouldn't it be nice if I could say, God, this is what restoration looks like. If I lose $1 on the street, I want that to be restored to me with a $100 bill, Lord. I'd love to do that. I'd be dropping dollars everywhere. You get me? God's idea of restoration is to make us into who He wants us to be. That broken vessel that He puts back together with beautiful, precious metals. God restores our very soul. Did you hear me say that? It's from Psalm 23. He restores my soul. As broken as it is, He restores it. As dirty as it is, as grieving, as painful as it is, He restores my very soul. So we can trust Him and we can lean on Him. In a moment, we're going to be singing a beautiful song. It is well. I am almost certain everybody here knows the story of that song. It is written in the middle of grief. It is written in the middle of pain. Loss of a wife, loss of daughters, crossing the ocean, and reaches this point where the captain says, this is where we believe your family was lost. And he's overcome with this song. He's overcome with the realization that in the midst of his grief, God is on the throne. He's overcome with the realization that in the middle of all this pain, God grieves with him. But in the middle of it all, God also restores him, gives him peace, and lifts him up. we look to this and we realize that in this time today, we have grief, we have pain, we have suffering. I think everybody here can look to your life and say, I am experiencing some form of grief. Maybe not at this moment, but in the past week, in the past month. Thinking about the things that you have lost, and you're overwhelmed. You have no ability to say, I will overcome. And God says, it's okay, I'm going to grieve with you. But I'm still wonderful. That's who God is. He is still magnificent. It's who God is. But in the end, God desires to restore us, to lift us up, and to make us whole. I'm going to ask Jeff to come up here and pray, and then we're going to close with it as well.
Heavenly Father, we come to you in the name of Jesus. Lord, we thank you, Father, for your word this morning, Father. Lord, as we come, Lord, we thank you, Lord, that it's not what it is, what it is, everything. You bring us to that place. We know that you walk through this room with us, Father God. It seems that the vessel with thorns in your hold constantly in this room. We thank you, Lord, you don't leave us. It may not be everything we would like it to be on this side of eternity, but when we cross over into the eternal glory, we're going to look back and be able to see exactly how you came through for us in the way that you used that, Lord, the challenge, the storm, Lord God, Father, that almost seemed a hopeless situation, and brought us more into the glorious image of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, making us more fit that we could step into and enjoy eternity in your awesome presence. Lord, there are those this morning who are walking through that time of grief. Father, it's a fresh moment of grief for them, Lord God, Father. We ask you that you would wrap your arms tightly around them, Lord God, Father. Remind them, Lord, that you are walking through this with them, Lord, that you still love them unconditionally, that you are still the one who is in control, not looking at the circumstances, but helping them to look away to you, Father God. Send those around them who would send words of encouragement, Lord God, to lift them up, Father God, and remind them of your awesome promises, Father God. Whether it be someone that's here this morning, Lord God, in the sanctuary, someone listening online, someone's going to hear this message, they usually reach down and thank you. You are the ever-restoring God, restoring the lens of eternity in light of what we think we need now. And we ask you to help us take this word with us, Father God, whatever lies ahead through the course of the week, and we ask you to carry the return, Lord. You bring us back to remembrance. We would stand fast on the promises of your word and be proven unshakable character, Lord. Be with each one, lead, guide, and direct. In Jesus' name we pray.
When peace like a river attendeth my way, when sorrows like sea billows roll, whatever my lot thou hast taught me to say, it is well with my soul. It is well with my soul. It is well.